When a woman pulls back, becomes distant, or suddenly acts unsure, most men immediately feel threatened. Their instincts tell them to chase, to fix, to hold tighter so she doesn't slip further away. But this instinct, this panic, only pushes her even farther. What truly is the dynamic is the opposite, pulling your attention back, not as a tactic, but as a natural response rooted in self respect and emotional control. When you stop reacting emotionally to every change in her energy, you instantly regain your power. You stop feeding the imbalance that created the distance in the first place. And without blocking her or begging for attention, you create something far more powerful. Space. Space is where attraction breathes again. Space is where desire rebuilds. Space is where she starts thinking, wondering, remembering the version of you that first captured her interest. The moment you stop overgiving and over pursuing, she is no longer overwhelmed by your presence. Instead, she becomes curious about your absence. She starts noticing the silence that used to be filled with your messages, your calls, your constant emotional availability, and that silence speaks louder than any words you could ever say. Pulling back your attention doesn't mean acting cold or indifferent. It simply means no longer pouring energy into someone who isn't reciprocating in the moment. It means allowing the dynamic to rebalance naturally without forcing anything. When you stop chasing, you automatically stop reinforcing her emotional power over the situation. You reposition yourself not behind her, not beneath her, but back into your rightful place as a man who values himself. And a man who values himself becomes intriguing, magnetic, and impossible to ignore. This shift doesn't happen because you're trying to manipulate her or play games. It happens because you're finally choosing yourself. When your focus returns to your purpose, your well being, and your life, she feels that shift. She senses the difference in your energy. Suddenly, you're not the man suffocating her with attention. You're the man she's starting to miss, the man she's realizing she took for granted, the man she thought would always be there, but now feels slightly out of reach. And this is exactly where her curiosity begins. Curiosity turns into reflection. Reflection turns into longing. Longing turns into action. When you pull back your attention, you activate the natural balance between masculine and feminine energy. You give her the room to come forward, to rear, engage on her own terms, to feel safe reaching out because your energy is calm, grounded, and controlled, not desperate or demanding. Men forget that attraction is never about pressure. It's about polarity. When you chase excessively, you collapse that polarity. When you pull back and stand firm in your value, you restore it. Women gravitate toward men who radiate stability, direction, and certainty. When you stop trying to convince her of your worth, she begins to rediscover it on her own. When you stop overextending, she starts leaning in. When you stop anxiously waiting, she starts wondering where your attention went. And that wondering is the beginning of her return. By not blocking her, you keep the door open. By not begging, you keep your dignity intact. By pulling back your attention, you create the exact conditions in which she can reconnect. You're not running from her. You're not chasing her. You're simply choosing yourself, and that choice shifts everything. And when life shows her that the calm, focused, disciplined version of you is rare, she'll feel that pull more powerfully than anything you could have forced. That's when she comes back, not because you begged, but because you showed your worth by living it. This is where everything starts to change. Sometimes the most powerful move you can make is the one that feels the hardest in the moment. Staying steady, calm, and emotionally grounded when everything inside you wants to react. When she becomes distant, when she tests you, when she pulls back her energy, your instincts scream at you to chase, to explain yourself, to fix something that isn't even clear yet. But this is exactly where most men lose their power because they start responding emotionally instead of intentionally. And emotional reactions rarely come from strength, they come from fear, fear of losing her, fear of being replaced, fear of being forgotten. But when you let fear drive your actions, you send a message you don't even realize you're sending, that you need her more than you need your own self respect. Neutrality, however, sends the opposite message. It tells her that you are unshakable, not cold, not detached, but centered. It tells her that you are not reactive to mood swings, mixed signals, or temporary distance. You are not a man who panics when things shift. Instead, you stand firm, steady, and emotionally mature, and that steadiness is attractive. It's rare. It's something she notices immediately because it separates you from the men who crumble the moment they feel uncertainty. When you stay neutral, you're not trying to force her to feel something. You're simply refusing to let her behavior dictate your worth. The beauty of neutrality is that it gives her space to reveal her real intentions. When you don't jump to chase her or over explain yourself, she starts feeling the natural imbalance that happens when she pulls back. Instead of you rushing to fill the silence falls into her hands. She begins to wonder why you aren't reacting. She starts thinking about whether you've emotionally pulled away too. And that thought is powerful because it shifts the frame. Instead of you trying to regain her attention, she begins to feel the absence of your energy. That absence becomes a mirror. And in that mirror, she sees whether she truly misses you. And when you maintain a neutral response, you give her the freedom to choose without pressure. Women don't respond to force, they respond to emotional leadership. They respond to the man who trusts himself enough to stay calm. When she texts inconsistently, when her tone changes, when her behavior becomes confusing, your neutrality becomes a signal of strength. You're telling her without words, I'm here, but I won't chase confusion. I won't feed chaos, and I won't abandon my own center just to match your emotional storms. This is where men misunderstand the power of neutrality. They think it means acting uninterested. But neutrality does not mean lack of interest. It means lack of desperation. It means you care, but not so much you lose yourself. It means you're present without being over invested. It means you're willing to walk away if the energy becomes one sided, but you aren't slamming the door either. You're simply choosing your peace above her uncertainty. And this emotional balance is what eventually makes her lean back in. When she realizes she can't sway you with distance, she tries closeness. When she sees she can't trigger you, she becomes curious about your steadiness. When she feels you're not collapsing under the fear of losing her, she begins to feel the potential of losing you. That's when everything shifts. Neutrality doesn't push her away, it invites her to step forward. It shows her the version of you that is mature, grounded, and controlled. The version she can actually trust, desire, and respect. And in the end, it's that controlled presence, not emotional panic, that brings the entire dynamic back into balance. There comes a moment in every man's journey when he finally understands that real power isn't found in what he says, it's found in what he chooses not to say. And when you stop chasing, stop over explaining, stop trying to convince her of your worth, something unexpected happens. She becomes the one who starts paying attention. Because silence, when grounded in self respect, speaks louder than anything you could say. Women are deeply intuitive. They feel energy before they analyze words. And when your energy shifts from trying to prove something to simply living your life, she feels it immediately. It unsettles her, not because she's angry, but because she becomes aware that the balance has changed. The man she could once predict is suddenly a mystery again, and mystery is magnetic. When a woman pulls back, she expects you to react. She expects you to chase, to question, to seek reassurance. But when you don't, when you stay centered, when you breathe instead of chasing, that unpredictability forces her to confront a question she never expected. Did he move on? That thought is uncomfortable for her because she thought she had time. She thought you would always be available, always waiting, always ready to step in the moment she snapped her fingers. But silence breaks that illusion. It shows her that you're not dependent on her attention for your identity. You're not standing still, you're moving forward. And when a man moves forward without bitterness, without games, without resentment, it creates a gravity that pulls her thoughts back toward him. It's in those quiet moments, late at night, during her routine, in between conversations with other people, that your absence suddenly starts to speak. She starts remembering the stability you brought, the way you listen, the comfort of your presence, the consistency of your energy. These aren't things another man can replace easily, if at all. And the more she tries to distract herself, the louder those memories become. Silence isn't emptiness, it's space. And space allows truth to rise to the surface. But here's the part most men overlook: silence makes her confront her own actions. When you stop trying to fix things, she's left alone with the reality of how she treated you. Maybe she pulled away. Maybe she took you for granted. Maybe she thought she had options that wouldn't cost her anything. But when you step back with dignity instead of drama, she begins to see her choices clearly, not through your words, but through her own reflection. And reflection is powerful. It forces emotional accountability, not because you demanded it, but because your silence allowed her to feel the consequences of her behavior. This is where the shift begins. She starts checking your social media more often. She starts wondering why you're so calm. She asks mutual friends about you. She becomes alert to anything that hints you might be moving on. She doesn't show it immediately. Women rarely do, but inside, that slow growing concern begins to build. And the more she feels it, the more she realizes she may have underestimated your value. Silence, when done from a place of strength and self growth, doesn't push her away. It brings her closer by making her confront the possibility that someone else may soon appreciate the version of you she took for granted. You don't have to announce your growth. You don't need to broadcast your confidence. Just keep living your life, evolving, improving, because when your silence comes from strength, not fear, it always reaches the places your words never could. And that is where true power begins. There comes a moment in every man's life when his silence stops being a reaction and becomes a message. And the message she feels the most, often long before she admits it, is that she no longer has access to the version of you she once knew. This is where the real shift happens. Because when a woman realizes that the emotional doorway she used to walk through without hesitation is now closed, even partially, it creates an internal tension she can't ignore. Before, she may have assumed you'd always be available to her emotionally. She may have thought she could drift in and out of your life without consequence. But when you stop responding instantly, when you stop giving endless reassurance, when you stop proving your worth and instead live in your worth, she feels the change more deeply than you think. Silence forces her to sense the distance, not because you're being cold, but because you're no longer pouring energy into someone who isn't pouring it back. And for a woman who once had your emotional presence at her fingertips, that shift is unsettling. She starts noticing the little things, your absence in her notifications, your lack of reaction to her posts, the fact that you're no longer orbiting around her. Those subtle things create a mirror, and for the first time, she sees a version of herself that perhaps she didn't want to face, a woman who misjudged your value. What makes this moment powerful is that you're not punishing her. You're not giving her the silent treatment to manipulate her. You're simply choosing yourself. You've redirected your focus toward your growth, your purpose, your peace, and that shift creates an energy she cannot replicate anywhere else. She begins to compare how centered you seem now with the chaos that may exist in her current interactions. She notices that while other men may seek her attention, your silence isn't an attempt to win or lose. It's a declaration that your life continues with or without her. That's what makes it so impactful. Women are far more emotionally attuned than most men realize. When your silence carries confidence instead of anger, she feels it instantly. When your absence isn't about avoiding her, but about prioritizing your life, she senses the maturity behind it. This is when she starts re-evaluating everything, your connection, her decisions, the way she treated you. And these realizations grow stronger in the quiet moments, late at night, in the middle of her day, when she scrolls through old messages, when she sees your name in her contacts, when someone mentions you unexpectedly. She begins to understand that your silence isn't emptiness, it's evolution. And with that understanding comes something deeper, fear, not fear that you're angry with her, but fear that she may no longer have a place in your world. Fear that someone else might now enjoy the emotional presence she once took for granted. Fear that her access has expired while she wasn't paying attention. That fear drives the internal conflict she tries to hide. She becomes more curious, more reflective, more affected by your distance than you'll ever see on the surface. Your silence becomes the proof that you're no longer anchored to her approval. It becomes the sign that you're choosing peace over pursuit. And it becomes a reminder that a good man's presence is not a guarantee, it's a privilege. When she realizes that her perspective shifts completely, and that shift is where everything starts to change. There comes a point in a man's journey where he finally understands that real strength isn't shown through chasing, convincing, or trying to force someone to see his value. Real strength is expressed through discipline, discipline over your reactions, over your emotions, and especially over your time. And this is exactly what she begins to feel when you stop doing the predictable things she expected. You're no longer reaching out impulsively. You're no longer checking her social media or trying to decode her every move. You've shifted your focus entirely, and that shift creates a ripple effect she cannot ignore. Women are far more aware of energy than they let on. They pick up on subtle emotional changes long before they speak about them. And when a man who once poured attention, consistency, and emotional availability into her suddenly stops over giving, she feels a sharp contrast. not because you've gone cold, but because the emotional supply she counted on consciously or unconsciously is no longer there. That quiet change hits harder than any angry text, any emotional outburst, or any attempt to seek closure. Your calm distance speaks louder than confrontation ever could. Key point five revolves around something powerful, you controlling the spaces. Instead of trying to pull her back, you allow her to sit with the consequences of her choices. Instead of trying to fix things, you let silence reveal truths. And instead of trying to be the nice guy who makes everything easy for her, you become the man who requires effort to reach. That's the shift she never saw coming. When you stop giving access so freely, she begins to understand how much access she actually had. And this is where her discomfort begins. She starts wondering why you're so okay, why you're not checking on her, why you're not reacting, why you're not trying to fight for a place in her world. The absence of your effort causes her to confront her own behavior, not because you demanded it, but because she now has nothing to distract her from the truth. Your silence forces her accountability. Your absence highlights the value of the presence she lost. The fact that you're moving forward without bitterness or dramatic exit sends a message she cannot escape. The quiet confidence you now embody becomes its own gravitational pull. Without saying a word, you're communicating maturity, stability, and self respect. You're showing her what a man with emotional discipline looks like. That alone can shift the dynamic in ways you don't expect. It makes her question whether she misjudged you, whether she acted too quickly, or whether she misunderstood your depth. Not because you're trying to make her regret anything, but because your behavior reflects truth, and truth makes people think. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply not react, not chase, not explain yourself endlessly. Just let your actions speak. Let your growth speak. Let your calmness speak. People understand your value when access to you is no longer guaranteed, especially when they once had it easily. She begins to realize that you're not angry. You're just done trying to prove your worth to someone who didn't appreciate it. And that realization hits harder than anything you could ever say. In the end, your silence becomes your strength, your detachment becomes your protection, and your growth becomes the very thing she never expected to witness. And that's when everything starts to shift. There comes a moment in every man's journey where everything becomes clear, not because someone explained it to him, not because someone apologized, and not because anyone returned to fix what they broke, because silence gave him the space to finally see things for what they really were. Key point six is about that shift, that awakening inside you when you stop waiting for someone to come back, stop obsessing over what she's thinking, and finally begin to understand what truly matters. And ironically, it's this exact moment, the moment you detach from needing anything from her, that becomes the moment she feels the deepest pull back toward you. When a woman realizes you're no longer emotionally tied to her decisions, something inside her starts to spiral. Not in a dramatic way, not in a loud way, but in a quiet, haunting way that lingers in the back of her mind. The curiosity grows, the questions intensify. She starts wondering what changed, what shifted, what softened inside you that made you stop reacting. She didn't expect you to be this composed. She didn't expect you to move forward gracefully. And she certainly didn't expect you to detach without bitterness. That kind of emotional strength is rare and it leaves a mark. This is where the truth hits her. She no longer has the same place in your life. And that realization creates a discomfort she tries to ignore but cannot escape. She feels it when she scrolls through her phone at night, when she sees your name but no longer sees any messages from you. She feels it when she posts something expecting you to view it and you don't. She feels it when she looks back on old conversations and realizes you were there for her in ways most men never are. She feels the absence of your emotional presence because your presence was once something she relied on, even if she never admitted it. But the deeper impact comes from another layer, your growth. When she sees that you've elevated yourself, that you've become more grounded, more focused, more centered in who you are, that's when regret creeps in slowly. She starts comparing the man she knew with the man you've become. She starts noticing how you're not chasing, not seeking validation, not waiting in the shadows for her return. Your silence isn't emptiness, it's evolution. And evolution always draws attention. This is the stage where she begins to rethink everything. She wonders if she made the right decision, if she gave up on something real, or if she underestimated the depth you brought into her life. She may not express it directly. she may not reach out immediately, but the internal conflict grows. That silence she once thought she wanted now forces her to confront her own choices without the comfort of knowing you're still waiting. And meanwhile, you're stepping into a version of yourself that no longer revolves around what she does or doesn't do. You're focusing on your purpose, your goals, your peace. You're rebuilding from the inside out. And in that rebuilding, you discover something powerful, that your worth was never defined by her recognition of it. You were always enough. You were always valuable. And now you finally see it for yourself. Ironically, this is when she feels the pull the strongest, not because you manipulated anything, not because you played games, but because authentic detachment is magnetic, genuine growth is attractive, and a man who no longer needs her attention becomes the man she cannot stop thinking about. In the end, the silence that once felt like loss becomes the very thing that restores your strength and the very thing that begins her regret.